Consumer privacy is a very important issue. It is increasingly the case that various large companies have gathered tremendous amounts of data about people, data about every facet of their lives. This data is being gathered on a massive scale, and it's being used in a myriad of different ways. There are countless companies gathering and using our data, from social media companies to various apps, to gaming companies, to various other types of businesses that are marketing to us, and also ones that are analyzing this data about us to try to determine our likes, our habits, what we might buy, what we might do, everything about us. And today, we're seeing the rise of AI, artificial intelligence, where massive quantities of data are being used to do a variety of different things, from make decisions about people to also generate images and text. This course will focus on consumer privacy law. We'll take a look at the various statutes that are being passed to regulate privacy, to try to bring this chaotic and vast world of information collection, use, and disclosure under control. How do these laws work? Do they work well? These are the things that we're going to talk about, because what we see is that there is a tremendous amount of legislation that has gone on in the past and that continues on today, and legislatures are really struggling to figure out what to do and how to protect privacy in today's age, and it gets more complicated as technology advances. In this class, we're going to proceed by looking at various key issues in privacy laws. We're going to look issue by issue, week by week, and we're going to explore in depth how the law deals with certain various concepts. These laws have things in common, and they rely on certain key components, certain key dimensions that we will be talking about. And I hope that at the end of this class, you'll be able to understand a wide variety of different privacy laws, as well as understand how these laws work, how they could be improved, how they might have shortcomings, how to practically comply with these laws, how to advise companies that are trying to administer their programs to work with these laws. Also, thoughts about what might work better in the future for privacy law. I hope you'll also be able to encounter new privacy laws and make sense of them. You'll be able to see their common elements. You'll be able to understand how they work, even laws that you've never seen before. And that's because privacy laws, despite the bewildering array of them and despite their differences, actually have a lot in common, or they draw from certain choices of approaches. And we're going to talk about the different approaches that the laws are going to take. Because this field is so dynamic, a lot of the work of a privacy lawyer is to understand new laws, to digest new laws, and to advise on how to comply with those laws, what to make of those laws, or to deal with cases where those laws are being enforced against a particular company. Or some lawyers are on the other side, challenging companies, trying to enforce the law against them. Privacy law has had a dramatic growth over the past 50 years or so, in particular, focusing on statutes, because a large body of consumer privacy law involves privacy statutes. These are laws made by legislatures, and they've been made by legislatures around the world. There are other components of consumer privacy law too, such as the common law torts, contract law, and other areas of law. But the focus of this course is going to be on the consumer privacy statutes that are being passed. How do these various laws work? How do these statutes work? Because the statutes today are the leading body of consumer privacy law. Let me give you a brief history of what has happened in the past 50 years when it comes to consumer privacy statutes. Starting in the 1970s, the EU and the US began to pass a number of statutes to protect privacy. In the EU, a number of countries passed laws that were comprehensive in nature to protect privacy. Ultimately, in the EU, this led to the EU Data Protection Directive in the mid-90s. This directive was kind of like a recipe book And it basically said to every member country in the EU that they had to have a privacy law, and it basically had the basic skeletal recipe of what had to be in that law. And then that then led to all member countries of the EU having a comprehensive privacy law. In the US, Congress started to pass laws to address various economic sectors and the privacy in those sectors. And these laws were one by one, quite a lot of different laws, but they regulated different economic sectors differently. This is known as the sectoral approach. And really, from about 1970 through 2000, Congress passed quite a lot of these laws, quite a lot of federal privacy laws to address different issues in different economic sectors. Then, after 2000, Congress slowed down a lot. Congress became more and more partisan, more and more dysfunctional, and we don't see as many federal privacy laws starting in this century. Instead, in the US, we see that many states have passed privacy laws, and the states essentially took over and started to lead the charge in passing privacy law. Let's go back to the EU, because there was a very important development in EU privacy law. In particular, I should say, in the EU, it's called data protection law, not privacy law. I generally refer to everything as privacy law, but the EU uses a different term, data protection. So in the EU, in 2016, the EU passes the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR. This is the most comprehensive and powerful privacy law in the world. It became effective in 2018. And it has had a tremendous influence on privacy law around the world. It also has had a tremendous influence on US law, as well as the practices of privacy by various US companies, especially multinational companies. We're going to talk about the GDPR a lot in this course. After the GDPR became effective in 2018, states in the US started to pass very broad consumer privacy laws. And now, quite a number of states have passed such laws. The first state was California, which passed its law in 2018. It updated that in 2020. And then other states followed suit, passing consumer privacy laws. These laws aren't quite as broad and quite as protective as the GDPR, but they are pretty broad laws, and they do a lot of things. And we're going to be talking about a lot of them because they draw from the GDPR, but they also take elements from the US approach to privacy. Beyond the US and beyond the EU, many countries around the world have passed privacy laws. There are more than 160 countries around the world that have a comprehensive privacy law. Most countries have passed privacy laws that are closer to the EU model of law than the US model. The US model is a very hard model to replicate because it's so messy. There's so many different laws, and they do so many different things, and they're very mishmash and inconsistent with each other. So a lot of countries adopt laws that are similar to the GDPR, but that have some differences here and there. Then also we have, beyond comprehensive privacy laws, there are laws dealing with specific privacy issues. Issues like biometric information, location information, social media, and so on. These specific laws will address specific problems and regulate in some different ways. My goal in this course is not to make you an expert on any one specific law, although I do think that you will learn a lot about the GDPR and a lot about some of the state privacy laws in the US. But my overarching goal, the most important goal that I want to do this semester, is to teach you about how the laws basically work, what their common elements are, how they function. I want to teach you what the different approaches are. So when a legislature is passing a privacy law, there are often different choices that must be made about certain key issues. So I want to look issue by issue and look at the different alternatives that legislatures can do with that regulation. So as I said, one of my goals in this course is that you'll be able to pick up any privacy law and right then see how that law works. Some of these laws are very long, they're very complicated, but you'll be able to see instantly what the different things are in that law. And right now, I just want to give you a broad overview of the basic structure of what a privacy law looks like. Now, not all laws have all these types of elements, but they often have a lot from this list of elements that I'm going to talk to you about. So if we categorize the elements, I think we could categorize them into two very broad categories, and they would be structural elements and substantive elements. Structural elements are things that basically about the scope of the law and the mechanics of the law, and substantive elements are about various rights and obligations that the law imposes. What are its specific protections? So let's talk about the structural elements of the law. So laws are going to have a scope. They're going to say, in particular, a geographical scope. They're going to cover either companies in that particular jurisdiction, but a lot of the laws have a broader scope, and they cover companies that do business in that jurisdiction, regardless of where they're located. Beyond the geographical scope, you also have a scope as to what the law actually covers. And this turns on the law's definition of personal data. Because if the law just regulates all data, then it's regulating the encyclopedia. It regulates basically an infinite amount of information in the world. It would be very hard to imagine how that law could work. So the idea of privacy law is to regulate information about people. And so ultimately, though, what is personal data? And this definition is actually a very hard and complicated issue. We're going to spend some time talking about this issue because how personal data is defined has a dramatic effect on how broadly the law regulates and what it covers. A lot of laws also protect a subcategory of personal data called sensitive data, and it protects sensitive data with heightened protection. And we'll talk about what it means to be sensitive data. How do we define what data is sensitive and what data is just regular personal data? Other structural elements of law include restrictions on the transfer of data. A lot of laws have cross-border data transfer restrictions, which limit the ability to transfer data outside of a particular jurisdiction. There's not many laws in the U.S. that do this. In fact, I can't think of any law in the U.S. that does this, but there are a lot of laws around the world, and especially the GDPR in the EU, that have these cross-border data transfer restrictions, and we'll talk about how those work. These laws also have enforcement provisions. Many laws are enforced by agencies, and they have penalties, and the various enforcers have certain powers, and the enforcement is structured in certain ways that can make it either more effective or less effective, and we'll talk about that. We'll also see that some laws have a private right of action where individuals can sue for violations of the law. Additionally, the laws have a certain framework for how data can be used, or the term in the EU is processed. And there's a big difference between how various privacy laws work. In the US, generally, you can use data, collect data for whatever you want to do, as long as you announce what you're doing in a privacy notice. In the EU, in contrast, they use the lawful basis approach, where you can only process data for a specified set of reasons that the law says. So the law says, here are the permissible reasons, and any other reason is not allowable. Another structural issue is preemption. To what extent do federal laws in the U.S., for example, preempt other laws that the states might adopt? Some laws will block any state law on that topic, no matter what it does. But other federal laws don't preempt in that way. They'll allow states to pass stricter laws. Let's turn to the substantive provisions in privacy laws. And they basically fall into three subcategories: individual rights, governance provisions, and duties and obligations. So let's first look at individual rights. Most privacy laws have quite a number of individual rights. These are specific rights that individuals have regarding their data. They can include the right to access one's data, the right to correct one's data, delete one's data, data portability, to object to uses of one's data, to opt out of certain things, or to opt into certain things. And there are other ones too, but those are the basic rights that individuals have. We're going to talk about these rights and how they work in practice. Next, the laws have governance provisions. A governance provision is a requirement that organizations that are regulated have certain internal processes and measures to protect privacy. These are things like having a privacy officer, which some laws require, but other laws don't. Having policies and procedures. Privacy by design, restrictions on how you can design things, or requirements that you have privacy by default. They involve things like doing privacy impact assessments. Other requirements include training about privacy, as well as vendor management, which involves managing and having contracts with various other entities that will receive data from a company. Regarding duties and obligations, these things include basic principles of privacy, basic rules for how to collect and use data. Things like data minimization. You don't take more data than you need. Restrictions on secondary use. Don't use data for a new purpose beyond the original purpose. Other things like purpose specification. Specify the purposes that you're using the data. They should be specific and disclosed to people. This also goes to a transparency obligation. Provide a notice of how you collect the data, what data you're collecting, and how you're going to use it. There could be data retention restrictions on how long you can keep this data. Another duty is data quality, which is to maintain the data accurately and keep it up to date. There are other duties that we'll be talking about later on in this course. So that's the basic recipe for a privacy law. Not all privacy laws have all the things that I just mentioned, but the laws have a number of those things. Many laws have a lot of them. And the approaches to each one are not always the same. They will diverge. And we'll talk about these various things. But if you look at a privacy law and you look at the way I've defined and showed you what the recipe is like, you'll be able to pick out things. You'll be able to say, aha, that's a governance provision. That's a scope of the law. And this deals with rights, or this is about certain duties or obligations that companies might have. Because this is basically how privacy laws work. I'm very excited to talk to you this semester about how privacy statutes are regulating privacy. This is an incredibly important issue. It's a very challenging issue because I don't think we really have good answers to this yet. I don't think that privacy laws work that well right now. I think we're also in the early days of figuring out how to regulate privacy. True, the laws have been being passed for about 50 years now, for a half century, but I still see them in their infancy. We still have a long way to go. And I think when we look back on things in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years or longer, we're going to see that the laws that we had now are going to look very outdated. In fact, I'll mention something interesting, and that's around the turn of the century, there was talk about having a comprehensive federal privacy law. And at that time, industry opposed that. And now, interestingly, industry is much more supportive of a comprehensive federal privacy law. I think mainly because states are starting to pass all these different laws. What's particularly interesting to me is that when I recall what was on the table, what people were talking about for a comprehensive privacy law in the United States back in 2000, it's dramatically different than what would be in a comprehensive privacy law today. The latest bills that I've seen in Congress have almost double, triple, quadruple the number of requirements and elements than what was there in 2000. And the laws are much more protective, much stricter than what would have been on the table in 2000. So we really see an evolution in privacy law. It's coming a long way. On the other hand, technology is moving very fast, even faster. Will privacy law be able to keep up? And how do we create privacy laws that are going to keep pace with technology? I'm very excited to be discussing these issues with you this semester because we're going to be talking about the forefront, the frontier of regulation of an incredibly important issue, our privacy.